Hello and welcome to this week's myNewsWrap, news from the world of SAP, the world of Microsoft and the world in between. Let's start with the SAP side of the house, and this week I really have some news for you from the SAP side, so let's get things started. Well, the gates opened this week and we have a lot of blog posts around Kyma. So starting first with the more generic ones and then coming to the highlight of this week. First blog post by Marco Dorn, guiding you through how to create the SAP BTP Kyma runtime, making use of the SAP BTP CLI. So you now can really completely use a CLI-based approach in order to enable the Kyma runtime, including sub-account creation, including entitlement, assignment, and so on. So that's really, really cool and helpful from my perspective. And there's just one thing that's still missing, and that's the download of the kubectl config that you cannot do with the CLI. For that, you still have to go to the UI, but that's okay. And then another very detailed blog post around using the Jamstack on the Kyma runtime in order to build a high-performance web app by Satya Isha. And there is there are quite some bits and pieces involved in there to make that app work, like Cloud for Edge, using the Kyma runtime with the API gateway, deploying a microservice which is based on Next.js, and then having Kyma eventing in the game, and also SendGrid for email delivery. So that's really a quite decent example, and it's also available code-wise on the GitHub repository, on the Kyma samples GitHub repository. Now that was already working for Kyma 1.24.x. Now news of the week. This week we are there. Kyma 2.0 was released on the SAP Business Technology Platform. So there is the upgrade. Kyma 2.0 open source was released at the beginning of December. So now you also have the managed offering on this version. I have linked the release notes in the show notes, which give you an overview what's new. There is also a section or a link, a reference to recommended actions. So there are some actions that are recommended that you do. And there is one thing what you have to do when you use the new Kyma 2.0, and that's updating your existing API routes. There is a migration guide available for that. Well, the release notes there, they are good to start, but the enablement team around Marco Dorn also started to bring out blog posts that give you a bit more insight and are also, where applicable, where it makes sense, backed by coding examples in the SAP samples repository. And I have referenced all blog posts that are available up to now, but for you, what's important to bookmark, follow, is the central blog post by Marco Dorn around the long-awaited update for the Kyma runtime, because there are all the other blog posts referenced in. And as you can see, when you take a look at the blog post, there are quite some topics that come up, like switching from XSUA-based access management to RBAC, very long-awaited feature, extending on-premise systems via the Kyma runtime. So you can now also extend S4 on-prem. Then event subscribing has changed a bit. This is also described here. Then what's available too is one important thing. You have now full access, or more or less full access, to the control plane. So you can install your own components, your own custom resource definitions. You can install the Kubernetes operators that you want within your Kyma instance. And there are two blog posts that guide you through. First one is how to install Dapper on your cluster, which is a bit tricky with respect to the interaction with Istio. And also another one by Gaurav Abi around using the Kubernetes operator within SAP BTP Kyma runtime. So stay tuned. The other topics that are not yet containing a link will be covered in the upcoming weeks. So with that, you are really equipped to make your journey with Kyma 2.0. There's also one thing that's important to mention if you have currently a Kyma 1.24 running. This is not yet upgraded. So only new clusters are currently provisioned in the Kyma 2.0 mode, and the rollout of Kyma 2.0 will be over the next weeks. So I think the first one is the trials that will be updated, and after that the real productive versions. Now, if you are just too curious and you want to try things out, the easiest way is to deprovision your trial cluster and then provision a new one, or just create a new trial cluster with a different user, whatever you like. Now, that's really the big news from this week around Kyma. There are also some more news from the SAP world. One blog post from Carlos Rogan that I would like to highlight is around security and OAuth 2.0 and understanding the token exchange when XSUAA is part of the game, because that's not super trivial to understand. And this blog post really guides you through how this token exchange is happening and what XSUAA is doing, what the app router is doing and not doing. And that's quite important to understand when you work with that stuff. Great blog post, as usual, by Carlos Rogan. And last but not least, article on computer and automation, which is a German magazine where DSAG published an article that's also interesting to read around the SAP Industry Cloud. So what's the perception of the German-speaking user group with respect to the Industry Cloud? And it's very interesting to read because there is not too much knowledge about that offering. And there's also some fair words about the, let's say, coverage of apps along all the different industries. So definitely interesting to read. Not too technical, but very interesting insights from the customer side. Yeah, with that, I think the longest SAP section since quite a while. Let's switch to Microsoft, because there is also a lot of things to tell. First things first, serverless. There is a new edition of the Azure Functions University where I had the honor to give another lesson around durable functions. Namely some advanced patterns like fan-out, fan-in, sub-orchestration, and external events. So that's available on YouTube, on GitHub, of course, so you can walk through there. Then from the other serverless offering, there is a blog post around Azure Static Web Apps and how to use it and how to compare it with Netlify. And this guides you through on how creating your application, how to deploy it, how to do some basic configurations around the setup of authentication, and then also some interesting stuff on, for example, migrating your GitHub pages to Azure Static Web Apps, which is referenced here, which is another blog post. So there is really some interesting news in this blog post area by John Rayleigh. Then another one around Azure Static Web Apps, this time about the deployment. And that's a really interesting one by Chris Reddington around using GitHub Actions and OpenID Connect on Azure in order to deploy static web apps to Azure. And that's a really detailed walkthrough all the topics to what you have to do within Azure Active Directory, within the app registration there, and what you have to do on the GitHub Actions side in order to make this flow work, and in order to make it secretless on the GitHub Actions side. And at the end of the blog post, there is also a quite decent conclusion or comparison on what's possible and what's not yet possible, or what are some flaws around that approach if you really want to go along that one. So really a great article, very useful from my perspective. And with that, let's switch to the area of containers. First of all, another overview article around Azure Container Apps by Serverless 360, which is also very interesting, gives you a great Insight describes some of the highlights of the Azure Container Apps, some of the limitations, and yeah, a great place to start from my perspective. And there are some more collections that I would like to highlight for you. First of all, a blog post collection by Thorsten Hans around Azure Container Apps with very interesting blog posts. For example, like traffic splitting in Azure Container Apps or exposing gRPC service in Azure Container Apps. So that's really, really interesting to read. Very valuable content. And last but not least, a collection of videos on YouTube around Azure Containers by Jason Haley. So really bringing together all the different stuff. And there is a lot of things happening at a lot of different meetups also, where you get some insights around the offering of Azure Container Apps. So definitely very valuable to bookmark this playlist. Now, with that, if you're starting with Azure Container Apps, well, it's an offering of Azure and it's container-based, but it's kind of, I wouldn't say proprietary, but it's Azure specific. And maybe you will hit limitations. Maybe you want to move away and you want to grow and want to move it to Kubernetes. And there is also now an open source project called AKA ACA to Kubernetes, which gives you the option to move your Azure Container Apps to Kubernetes. Now, I have referenced the GitHub repository within the show notes, and now don't make the same mistake as me, because I opened the GitHub repository and thought, that's just a README. What is going on here? The code is currently under development, and it's in the dev branch. So you have to go to the dev branch to see all the magic that is happening there. But that's also something that's really interesting, and it's also good to see that that's kind of possible from the beginning to know, hey, I can start with Azure Container Apps, but maybe I will grow out of the use cases and then I can easily switch to Kubernetes. That's really cool. And then another blog post around Azure Kubernetes Service, AKS, by Richard Hopper, Pixel Robots. That's a really interesting one. He's dealing with the question of who is responsible with updating add-ons and extensions that you deploy on top of your Azure Kubernetes service. So add-ons and extensions are both two concepts that you can use in order to enrich the stack of AKS, so to say. And it's not crystal clear who is responsible for what when it comes to patching those things. And that article gets you covered. So that's really great stuff by Richard. Then another GitHub repository that I came across called Capsule is also quite interesting. It's not brand new, but I came across it this week with respect to making Kubernetes multi-tenant, because as of now, Kubernetes is not really multi-tenant enabled. You can have namespaces which give you some logical separation, but the risk of noisy neighbors and the tenant separation is not really secure. And this is where a Capsule steps in. So I think that's interesting to see how they do it and how they make things secure there. Interesting starting point. And if you're facing the issue of having to deal with multi-tenancy requirements within our Kubernetes cluster, then I think this project is definitely worth a look. Then another topic around the, let's say, Kubernetes ecosystem, Dapper. There was another community call this week. And per se, the community call, of course, is interesting, but there was one topic that I want to highlight out of that community call. And that's with Dapper deployments that have now reached a 1-year lifetime. And as you might know, Dapper uses some certificates in order to set up MTLS. And you can use the ones that are delivered with Dapper or are created during the deployment of Dapper. Now, if you have been using them now for quite some time, exactly 1 year, then you need to do a certificate rotation. And this community call, the specific section gives you insights on how to do that. So don't forget that. If you have anyway used your own certificates, which is perfectly possible within Dapper, well, then you anyway are aware of certificate location, hopefully. If not, then please have a look at it. And wrapping up the Kubernetes or container area thingy in this news wrap, one further blog post that I would like to highlight is, again, from Microsoft on how Nokia is using Azure Arc to empower customers in a multi-cloud world. So that's also an interesting insight, of course, more marketing-y, around how to use Azure Arc or how our customers use Azure Arc for a multi-cloud scenario. So that's also quite interesting to see how this functionality is leveraged there. Now with that, let's switch to the DevOps part. First things first, there is a great talk around reusable GitHub workflows in order to automate, I think it's token exchange. That's really interesting. I have mentioned reusable GitHub workflows from time to time, but this is really something where you have to wrap your head around. So that's not a completely no-brainer. So you really have to think a bit about how do I structure it and how do I make those stuff reusable, what makes sense, what makes no sense. And this video gives you quite some nice insights on that topic. How to do things, how to set things up, how to make things going. Then some news from the GitHub area per se. If you're using code spaces and you're working with large repositories, you might have had the challenge that the loading time is not super fast. So you can now, with a public beta, pre-build your code spaces. So you can create pre-built code spaces with, of course, then make your startup time much, much, much faster. And the blog post that I've referenced within the show notes guides you through on how to get into the public beta and how to get the pre-builds working in your code space area. Then two other announcements from the GitHub area. First of all, security workflows. So GitHub is quite active around the area of security and already gets you covered a lot. And you now also have the option to, or have it more comfortable to find the right GitHub action flows, workflows for security purposes. There is now a new category, a security category that you can choose within the GitHub Workflows overview, where, again, based on your repository, of course, the best fitting workflows are proposed for you. So that's really, really cool, really great thing. In order to get your repository hardened. Then there's also another nice announcement from the area of security by GitHub. And that is the GitHub advisory database, which lies behind all the notifications around security. And that is now open for community contributions. So you can now, if you are active in that area, if you think you have a contribution to that advisory database, you can now add that. And it's based on an open standard, so there is no proprietary notion around that. And this blog post guides you through how you can contribute to the security advisory and what database format is used, and some additional links around supply chain security. But that's, again, a really cool move by GitHub. Then let's move on to the broader thingies around the Azure or Microsoft ecosystem. There is one repository that I would like to highlight, and that's in the Azure organization. It's called Always On. And Azure Always On is an open source project that, as the name already highlights, gives you an approach around building highly reliable cloud-native applications on Microsoft Azure. Of course, if you have a mission-critical workload, that's something that you want to have. If you have something that's anyway not necessarily needs to be always available, well, that's over-engineering. But if you have those mission-critical workloads and you want to make sure that they are super highly available, then this repository is definitely worth a look. It contains architectural guidelines. It contains design methodologies. It helps you with some reference implementations on different topics, including CI/CD, using GitHub and Azure DevOps. So that's really something that I think is super valuable and super helpful. And I did not dig too deep, but I would say it's also valuable for other clouds, because only the implementation details would differ, but the architecture, I mean, if you have to have it high available, the architecture stays the same. And another news from Microsoft around an acquisition that they made some time ago from CloudNox Security. And it's now integrated into their overall offering for security, for permission management, for cloud infrastructure entitlement, called CloudNox Permission Management, is now available in public preview. So if you're working in that area of multi-cloud security, if you have to deal with the challenges there and are running on Azure, then I think that's definitely worth a look. Which helps you quite a bit. I mean, it's an existing offering that was integrated, so I would say maturity should already be quite high. And then for the NuGet users, so especially the of course the .NET ecosystem, there is an update with respect to, again, security. NuGet.org will require two-factor authentication starting from March the 8th. So that's something that you have to keep in mind if you are interacting with NuGet in order to improve your supply chain security for your .NET packages. I've referenced the blog post that guides you through why they did it and what you have to do. So if you're using NuGet, take a look at that one. With that, let's switch to the world in between SAP and Microsoft. And of course, as every week, we have the SAP on Azure podcast with the usual suspects around Holger Bruchelt. And this week, there was another one around Microsoft Sentinel for SAP. So how can you secure your SAP systems running on Azure with additional services that are available on Azure, like Microsoft Sentinel? Again, very, very interesting from my perspective, bringing the infrastructure as a service world together with all the high quality services that you can use in order to improve the overall, let's say, package around your SAP system. I think really, really interesting. Then another blog post by Martin Pankratz around private link. As you know, SAP BTP Private Link Service is available in beta, but not all platform as a service offerings are already available and supported with this private link service. Now, this blog post by Martin guides you through on how to overcome this gap with let's say a workaround solution in the best sense, because it's quite production grade. And what do you have to do in order to use the private link service and connect them to services that are not yet in scope, like the Azure API management? That's the example that is used here. And there are two ways how to do that, and both are highlighted in the blog post. It's not as smooth as it would be offered, but if you want to use it, I think that's the perfect way to go, and that's definitely the blog post to look for if you do that. Now let's switch to Learning and events. There is one blog post, not super new, I have to admit, but it crossed my path this week around OAuth 2. And there is a very, very detailed and very, very easy to digest, if that's even possible with OAuth 2, blog post around authorization code grants flow. Blog post is in German, but there are tons of images in there how this flow works. So I think it's even digestible if you're not a German speaker. So that's if you have to wrap your head around OAuth and especially the authorization code grants, this blog post might help you a lot. And then for those of my listeners, my watchers who are working with JavaScript, there is the State of JavaScript report out around the state of JavaScript in 2021, around what is used, what's new, how is the demographic contributions with respect or usage with respect to JavaScript, what are libraries, opinions, and so on and so forth. So quite something nice to take a look at the weekend. And then there have been two events that I would like to highlight. First one is the first SAP community call on the SAP Cloud Application Programming Model, CAP. So this week that happened, it was recorded or it was broadcasted, streamed on YouTube. Many thanks for that. So not SAP proprietary platform. So it's available on YouTube. That's great. So if you have missed it, then take a look at it. There are also quite interesting roadmap slides that you might be interested in when you have questions around when might CAP go open source. And there was another great first session around the Azure Cloud Native Meetup that was founded in the UK. And there was a talk by Brandon Burns, who is one of the co-founders of Kubernetes. And this 1 hour talk is definitely worth it. It's great to learn from Brandon about the state of Kubernetes, how it's evolving, where it came from, what are kind of things that are developed upon Kubernetes and why that happens, like all the serverless offerings that are there. That's really super valuable from my perspective. And then, with that, if you want to learn or do more over the weekend or in the next week, there is also something from the developer experience area, I would say, that is really interesting. One article by Thomas Bond about architecture decision records. So how do you document your architectural decisions? And this blog post guides you through the concept of architecture decision records. I have seen and used them now at SAP, and they are really super valuable from my perspective. So that's definitely something to take a look at. And they do not have a big overhead. So usually when you think about any architectural documentation thingy, that's just a lot of paperwork. No, that's absolutely the opposite. So that's super cool. And another frequent guest on this show, Golo Roden, brought out a new video this week. Highly appreciated, about how to deal with the information overflow that you have, information overflow that you have when you are working in the IT. So that there is that many news and not infinite amount of time. So how can I stay up to date with when dealing with software development, when dealing with IT? Again, it's in German, but definitely worth watching. Very, very well spent 15 minutes. And with that, I'm at the end of today's session. Again, let's welcome Kyma 2.0 on the SAP BTP. I hope you make your hands dirty with that one. And of course, with all the other things that I've presented in this session. Hope I had some interesting news for you, some stuff to catch up. And with that, I wish you a nice Saturday, a great Sunday, and a successful next week. See you again next Saturday. Until then, bye.